Of Your Brain at Work Live. I'm your host, Shelby Wilburn. For our regulars, we're happy to have you back. And for those of you that are new, thanks for being here today. In this episode, we're going to be discussing accountability at work and why it matters more than ever. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the chat or comments where you're joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps, so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. We have a full house. So, for our first guest. Since joining NLI in June 2022, he has honed his passion and expertise in promoting the research-based habits and behaviors that help individuals reach their full potential in the workplace. With a graduate degree from Azusa Pacific University and an undergraduate from Creighton University, he works with NLI's talent and performance practice to drive tangible, lasting impact across projects and partnerships through NLI's community for organizations to elevate and enable their people. Please join me in welcoming Associate Consultant at NLI, William Watkins. Will, it's great to have you here today.
Thanks, Shelby. Happy to be here.
Nice. Our next guest for today is fascinated by the complex relationship between our behavior and neural activity. He pursued this interest at University of Buffalo, where he earned his master's in neuroscience, as well as completed his PhD in cognitive psychology at Syracuse University. Now, as a team member at NLI, he focuses work on interpreting and translating scientific research into actionable insights for organizations. He uses his expertise in cognitive psychology, specifically in human memory and decision-making, and advanced computational analysis to advise, inform, and support the creation of our scalable solutions. Please join me in welcoming the Director of Impact and Measurement at NLI, Dr. Ryan Curl. Ryan, it's great to have you here.
Hey, Shelby. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Nice. And our moderator for today is the Director of Research at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as helps to communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she was professor at Dominican College and New York University and a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the Director of Research at NLI, Dr. Emma Sarro. Thanks for being here today, Emma, again, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Shelby. So excited to be here with both you, Ryan and Will. As you all know, we've been working pretty hard together on understanding this construct. And just for anyone who's been here the last couple of weeks, we've kind of been like building up towards this topic, and we're going to culminate in a larger discussion next week on kind of the combination. But last week we covered a bit of our POV around the neuroscience of psychological safety. Like a necessary second step is really covering the idea of accountability in the workplace, and we'll touch on a little bit about how they are kind of like a necessary balance between the two of them. And really dive in specifically into the idea, like what is accountability, the two different forms of accountability and the shift that we need to make it more of a productive and growth-oriented version of it. So really lucky to have both Ryan and Will here because they're bringing two really important perspectives. So Will is in front of clients all the time. He's talking to the industry. He has an idea of like what clients are seeing in the workplace, what matters to them, and how do they see accountability. And Ryan is able to support this with how, what happens in the brain when we don't have accountability and how to create the right version of it. So we're going to be able to, swing back and forth between these two perspectives and really put it together. One thing that I do want to kind of get everyone kind of thinking on this, and this is going to help us too as we think about, how to shift from a form of accountability that may hold people back to one that might allow people to grow, is just think about what is accountability. When you hear the word accountability, when you think about it being placed on you, or when you think about your team, what's the word that comes to mind? And I'd love to hear from both you, Will, and Ryan, when you think about it, maybe before we dove into this research, what are thoughts that are coming up for you all when you think about accountability?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think for me, when I think about accountability, it's how you really demonstrate,
your internal responsibility to external partners, right? So when I think about responsibility, it's kind of like how I kind of keep in alignment with myself, and accountability for me is really how do I do that for others? So if someone's asking me to do something, how do I show up and make sure that I accomplish and do what I've been asked to do? And Ryan, I'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah, I think that's right on, Will. And I think for me, when I, first started digging into the accountability research, I was blown away by how differently it was perceived and defined, and in certain contexts it'll come up and sort of framed in different ways. So really, like for me, the first step in was really trying to wrap our minds around, what's the most useful way to understand accountability, and what therefore, what should we focus on in terms of how to build it within organizations too. So that was really what came up for me when we first dove in.
Yeah. It's great. I mean, the comments that are coming in are amazing. Actually, you're almost doing our work for us. But one thing that Marie Daniels said, and this is going to lead to the next kind of idea that we're going to cover, is there are two views. There's one that's a personal accountability and one that is holding others accountable. So this kind of leads right into what we think about, like the definitions of accountability and why there are like words that sometimes we misinterpret. So Ryan, can you kind of dive into these and help us kind of understand them?
Yeah, sure. First, I just want to call it Michelle's comment in the chat. I think seems like pretty much nailed it right there. I think we can close it out for the day, because speaking about role clarity, understanding the results, good or bad, that we'll talk about that throughout the session. So I think that's right on. But yeah, so I think what we, what I think what we first understood was that there are these lot of really related terms that sort of refer to separate but relevant aspects of accountability. And the first part is this idea that you're intrinsically motivated to set goals and reach them for your own personal benefit. And that's sort of responsibility. It's really a personal aspect of something that will build into accountability. But accountability, especially in the workplace, has a social component to it. There are social commitments made that are ideally clarified and understood and agreed upon. And then those things have to be met or are negotiated, right? So there's this social aspect to it, which brings an entire other realm in terms of, making sure that we're clear about tasks being assigned to us, that we feel that we can accomplish tasks being assigned to us. And that's that we're seeing the world the same way or similarly enough, across our teammates, up and down the hierarchy throughout our organization too, to form this sort of holistic version of accountability, which then leads us to, I think, pursue the desire to want to have ownership over certain tasks, projects that are going on in the workplace. And so, yeah, this is kind of a rough kind of formulation of how we see these things feeding into each other and kind of forming this desire for ownership. What do you think, Will? Anything else coming up?
Yeah, I think the important thing here too is that from an organizational perspective, we can't make people more responsible, right? That's a self-choice. But what we can do is create an environment where accountability can happen and can be easier to accomplish. And that's a lot of what we're really focusing, I think, the time here today is talking about that piece versus sort of how well you're keeping up with your New Year's resolutions, so to speak, right? I think that's the framing that we want to really keep in mind here as we think about, not just what is accountability, but how do organizations really allow it to thrive in their cultures.
Yeah. So you can imagine a world where you might have individuals that are very good at holding themselves responsible for their tasks, but without having like an organizational, like understanding or environmental, like culture of accountability, you won't actually have like true ownership. All right. So let's talk about like, what's the state of accountability though, right? It's not that easy. Bill,
and Emma, I think this is kind of the biggest position. It's 91% of employees really agree that accountability is important, and yet from our own research in 2020 on performance management, 97% of both managers and employees struggle with accountability. Not just it's challenging, but it's actually used the word struggle with accountability. And I think that's a critical piece here, is that it's something that we know needs to get done. We all value it, but it's something that is so challenging for organizations to accomplish. And I think there's some really critical statistics here on the next slide of just how that shows up for organizations. And while employees struggle with this, 18% of executives actually say this is their biggest weakness, is actually being able to hold people accountable. So when we think about totality of an organization from just 97% of employees think it's hard, but even senior executives say this is the thing I struggle with the most. And that really translates to is that for employees, 60% of employees are really unsure what it takes to succeed in the organization. So they don't even know what they're really going to be accountable to. And then about 93% of response from this really great cultural partner study on accountability about 3 or 4 years ago really say that they're unable to align the work they do and then how to be accountable for the desired results. So there's this big disconnect in the workplace right now of the desire to hold people accountable, desire to have an accountable workforce, and what we're seeing in terms of trends. And it really translates a lot into the type of accountability we try to put in and the type of accountability organizations try to foster in trying to hold people accountable per se. And we'll see this in the next slide when we talk about the difference between a type of accountability we may have thought of as driving results versus what actually drives results.
Yeah. And actually, I just want to come in real quick with a question from Ashley. Do you think, because this is kind of pertinent right now, do you think accountability expectations have changed post-pandemic and moving to a remote workforce?
Absolutely. And I think not only have they changed, it's become what we've seen both in our research on hybrid and the accountability research is it's harder and harder for managers to understand, how do I hold someone accountable in a hybrid work environment? What does that look like? How is that different? What skills do I need to have to do that? And it's really changed because we've gone from a world where if I can see you, then I can talk to you, then I can get you understand where your work is, right? And there's more of a fluidity with the work environment we have right now. Are you in? Is this person in on this day? What are they working on? And there's a lot of trust that's a part of that. And I think that's drastically changed, and we've seen over the past year in organizations moving from what felt like sort of I don't want to say it was we were trying to get through COVID, and now we're in this post-COVID environment where we're sort of the pendulum swinging back, where we're kind of moving to sort of more of that accountability of forced rankings and performance management systems, trying to return to office with sort of a mandatory components that we're seeing. And I think it's because we're trying to solve this particular issue and we don't know how to do it well.
Yeah, and I just think I'll add quickly too that we're also dealing with the incorporation of new technology into the workplace now too, which contingent on our view or like our overarching like the state of accountability within the workplace, that new technology can be used in drastically different ways, right? Like you might decide that a strong bit of surveillance-based technology, which is getting cheaper and cheaper and easier to do, might be a form of accountability in your mind, in your workplace, right? So I think we're really at this place where we need to get accountability right, or else it can go drastically wrong, considering the things Will just said, and now this push for new technology into the workplace that's already happening and going to be escalating here in the near future too.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it seems like kind of, the easiest way forward, let's just use some kind of like easy technology to make sure others are accountable without trying to get it right. So I think we should just go into what we're kind of talking about, this shift of behaviors, because accountability doesn't have to be a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a negative term. It doesn't have to be something that we're afraid or avoid. It should be something that all of us lean into. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this shift. What is this shift that we're talking about from something that's more punitive to something that's more growth?
Am I taking that one?
Sure.
More than
Yeah.
yes. So, and actually, I love Anna's comment in the chat about like this sort of surveillance accountability that I was referring to being like policing. And yeah, I think that's right. And what we're sort of referring to here, how we're framing that is punitive accountability. And I think that stems from the idea that, through what we've learned from the research and the way that people speak about accountability and how people perceive accountability is that it's just a term. It's not good or bad in and of itself. It's perceived drastically differently between individuals, across organizations, between researchers that we've noticed too. And so what we did here was we sort of extracted these two forms of accountability. One that's this kind of negative form, and then this ideal shift to this better form. So this kind of negative form we're framing as punitive accountability, which is that like, look, we have someone to blame for mistakes that happen within the organization, right? We go about our tasks, something happens, and we distribute blame accordingly. And that's sort of this punitive form of accountability that leads to fear. It leads to suppression of, an honest account of what happened or what you were assigned, right? And there's many things that are linked to that too that we'll talk about later, like psychological safety, growth mindset, that are hindered through this sort of punitive form of accountability that, someone must be blamed for the things that happened here. And instead, we want to see this shift to growth accountability, which is that, we understand that not only do mistakes happen, but they're like the doorway into growth and progress. So we balance productivity with the understanding that things aren't going to go the way that perfectly the way that we laid out, that we can sort of get the most out of that and hold each other accountable while understanding that we're always progressing, growing, capable of mistakes and moving forward in a way that's really healthy and adaptive. And I think well aligned with what I'll talk about later, really the way humans have evolved to desire and what we're built for. So yeah, I'll pause there. William, or am I anything to add?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
Will.
think really great description, and I think it's the idea, right, of where accountability is how I produce results to how I show progress, how I show that I'm developing, how I show that I have reached the goal that I need to set out to do. And I kind of view, we'll get more into the psych safety element, but it sort of punitive is like it's all on me. I don't have control over what the outcome is, to growth, which is I need to ask for help for this. I need to get like to solve the problem that I'm not able to meet. I'm still accountable for what the solution is, but I need to figure out how to make that happen versus I don't know how to make this work. Is kind of the way I'm seeing this kind of come through when we get to the elements a little bit later. But I think it's a really great shift in how we're thinking about from a fixed approach of who do we blame to sort of how do we own a solution to what needs to happen.
Yeah, and there's some really great comments coming in. It's hard to kind of keep up with them, but Lindsay just had this really great kind of analogy or an experience where she had a leader that helped them understand that there was a difference between a mistake and negligence. And that's, I think, a really important difference. And I don't know if any of you want to talk to that, like how that difference comes up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. To me, that and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, that comes with the like collective clarity around what's being assigned and what's expected, right? And the freedom to to think clearly and to discuss clearly about, what unforeseen events happen throughout the chain of events, and so that there's so that the picture is more clear in terms of what's negligence versus what's an honest mistake, what could be foreseen, what couldn't have been, with real like clarity across the board, in that really critical social element that I think accountability done properly builds on.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great point.
Yeah. All right, so let's move into kind of how we often try to, like, before we dive into the science, right? It seems, and a lot of us are kind of catching on to this now, that there's a shift in a mindset. So how do we like most simply think about the shift of like how we even define same word? How do we look at the word differently? Will, do you want to talk to this slide a bit?
Yeah, I think when we look at this CR, it's really sort of like think about this time of shifting from blame and mistake to owning the solution, right? And so I think there is a lot of times where when we think about accountability in sort of that conventional wisdom it's either I'm going to say I didn't have enough time, I didn't have this. It's sort of think about it was the market, XYZ was happening, versus accountability is people are empowered to own their solutions. Okay, so this didn't go right. So now how do I fix this? How do I take the feedback I've been given to figure out on how to solve this moving forward and really hold on to how do I drive the result that needs to happen? And I think those are two very different things. And I think it allows us to also to have the autonomy and control of actually creating a solution in more of a really growth mindset approach.
Mhm.
Whereas I think when we look at the conventional wisdom approach, it's sort of like the game of Clue, right? Like who did it? When did they do it? What did they do it with? We're not really thinking in a sense or a mindset of how do we actually empower a solution that drives forward progress in organizations.
Absolutely. So I think what everyone's waiting for is really to talk about like where at its core this is coming from, and maybe how and what we typically do is use this to help us understand what to do better, right? How to build this better. So Ryan, would you talk about this whole idea of goal pursuit and like how that links to accountability?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I think the heart of it and the core message here is that, we're really built for what we're framing as this growth form of accountability. And one way to think about that is to understand, in this case, and what's kind of being represented here is how our dopaminergic system pushes us towards goal pursuit. And so a common misconception regarding how dopamine functions in the brain is that it's sort of the reward at the end of an accomplishment. And there's some truth to that, but the really, I think, more important and more accurate way to think about dopamine is that it's built for us it's built so that it can push us towards accomplishing our desires, to moving towards our desires. It's our motivating force, said another way. And within that is the understanding that, and I think this is so important in the context of accountability, that we live in a insurmountably uncertain world. And so the dopamine system is built to make some prediction about our reality and about our expectations in the world contingent on how we act, our understanding of how others will act, which is also critical for accountability. And it's constantly updating and learning based on feedback that's coming back in. And ultimately with the goal of motivating us to move forward, to accomplish our goals, to make good on our promises, et cetera, right? But there's this huge social component and there's all these factors that are getting fed in to make these predictions that are ultimately laced through how our dopamine is disseminated throughout our brain. So one key aspect of this is, and you can go to the next slide there, Emma, please, if you would.
Oops.
Yep. Is through reward prediction error. And so the key kind of heart of this of the take-home message here is that this system is highly sensitive to feedback. That's really the key piece here. So it makes some prediction about what is to be expected and some reward associated with that expectation. And then we process reality, what actually happens, and we learn from that. And so that's really what we're built for, is that like clear signal of feedback to move us towards goals, to make us better, to help us to accomplish more things. And that's really what we want as humans, I think, overall. And so how this links to accountability is that accountability done properly allows for clarity in this feedback system so that we can talk to each other about, hey, this is what I said I was going to do. I was super clear about this. I understood what my teammates were going to do. And now here's what's happened. Now let's talk about why, right? With full honesty, full sincerity, constructive, a constructive nature built into all of that. Alternatively, if we're in a punitive accountability system, I might think in my mind, this is what I said I was going to do, but I have to keep that to myself, right? I have to figure out someone else to blame for this mistake. And might also fear being honest about someone else's contribution because it could hurt them, it could hurt their performance, right? There's all this noise in the feedback system if we have this punitive accountability culture that in our organization and I guess in our lives more generally. And so I guess the overarching point is we're built for clear feedback and we need that for proper accountability in the workplace. And I think to more broadly get the most out of like the human experience in general. It's really what we're wired for.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And maybe kind of like the other side of the coin is that because we're constantly updating, what happens when, let's say, like a leader, says they'll follow through with like X, Y, and Z, and then that doesn't happen. Like what happens in the brain, let's say, when that expectation is not met?
Yeah, and that gets to the heart of the fact, like the difference between responsibility and accountability is this really social component. And so one way to think about that is through the potential of scarf, threat, and reward, right? Where we have some connection with each other in terms of our, how I'm being perceived by others and how they're perceiving me, and the degree to which we feel connected to each other, that we respect each other, that we can count on each other, that we're giving each other proper clarity and autonomy, right? So these things can be threatened through this either real or perceived deviation between what was said would be done and what was actually done, right? And that ultimately links, and I think this is something that came up in the chat earlier on too, that from that comes this clear link from accountability to trust, right? Where we want to have that trust in each other, which is really, I expect this thing of someone else, even though we live in an uncertain world where many curveballs can be thrown our way, right? Like that's really what trust is. I trust you to do this thing in spite of the fact that there's a lot of unknown variables that exist in our reality, but nonetheless, I trust you. And that trust can be damaged through misinterpretation of either what was actually what someone actually committed to and what they actually did, right? And if there's all this noise in terms of, you know, what actually happened and what people feel comfortable saying to each other, right? You know, that's kind of has a psych safety vibe to it and a growth mindset angle as well. The more that there's noise there, the more that trust will be broken down, and the more that we'll feel this kind of social threat that will damage our ability to have, you know, what we're coining growth accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's just coming to mind a bit is just thinking about the social piece of this, that we are so sensitive to what we observe around us too in our social interaction. So if we observe that the culture is that one where individuals are punished, it's more punitive, then they'll also react in the same way, and they're more likely to blame others. And so this is the way it is around here, that we blame others for not getting things done. It will just continue. So it truly is a culture shift that we have to kind of think about making the set of behaviors that we put in place that we continue to do and reward. So the onus, I guess, on all of us, and maybe leaders first, and kind of like role modeling the behaviors that we want to see. One thing that I just wanted to throw to Will is just this idea of the punitive accountability here, and the way that Ryan's been talking about it. Like, what processes do you see in place, like in the workplace, that really get in the way or foster the punitive accountability?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest one is how performance management and compensations run. I think that's really where it's sort of that end, that's the end point for where it happens. So if we design a performance management system that is forced stacked rankings, where it's who's fitting on here, and you're trying to sort of show up in a way where it's all about the result piece and not how you've developed or grown, and that's sort of what's reinforced as well, and how you develop leaders who then continue this type of punitive accountability. And I think, you know, beyond that as well, within terms of systems, there's also a big component of just how you actually tell employees what success looks like, right? There's a lot of written and unwritten rules in organizations, and the more you can flesh out that culture in a really essential way, the easier it is for people to understand, okay, this is what it looks like to be successful, right? And I think we see that show up in the culture of accountability, but also the systems that reinforce that.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about I'm sorry, Ryan, did you have something else to say?
No, I was just agreeing. It's a good point. Nope, that's it.
Yeah. So we want to make this shift, right? So how does this look then? Ryan, do you want to talk?
Yeah, so this was actually some really neat research that came out maybe within the last year or so, where they elucidated the mentality of people who thought of accountability more as a threat versus those that thought of it as more of a worthy challenge, is the way the researchers framed it. And they kind of dug a little bit more deeply into what little components of that separate this perception of accountability that we can kind of extract from the individual. And actually, importantly here, and probably should have been represented in this slide, and maybe it's obvious, is that this difference in how accountability was perceived had a strong link to intention, workplace satisfaction, and intention to leave the workplace as well. So critical how we're viewing accountability, but also our view of accountability needs to align with reality within the workplace as well. So, okay, that's an aside. But what they found was that those that thought of accountability more of a threat, felt as though they did not have control over the outcomes within the workplace, so that their contribution really had nothing to do with what happened at the end of the day. And what, you know, was the interesting kind of hopefully insight for leaders is, you know, to what degree, if you see that perspective, or if you're aware of that perspective within your employees, to what degree is it true, right? Because you might want to change the perspective, but you may also want to change the degree to which your employees really do have influence over, you know, overall outcomes. And with this feeds this sort of pessimism that you might pick up on in the workplace as well. The sort of, we're not going to succeed anyway mentality, why does it matter kind of mentality will, and you know, maybe it's somewhat obvious that will lead to this this perception of not wanting to take accountability or take ownership of tasks. And then last but certainly not least is this idea of to what degree I'm actually capable of doing the things I'm accountable for, right? Or being told that I'm accountable for. I think it stands to reason that if you don't feel like you can actually do the things that you're being held accountable for, you're going to think of accountability as a threat. And so I think there's two really key ways I think leadership can understand this. The first way is if you're picking up on these perspectives, it follows logically how your workforce will treat accountability and will think of accountability. And you can start being a little bit more nuanced in terms of how you start addressing this. We need perception and reality of more control over the workplace. We need optimism, right? We need to know that our contributions will matter, right? And will create, this sort of bright future as it's written here. And then either both confidence in their ability to achieve their goals, but also skill building when necessary, right? Let's make sure people are capable and feel that they're capable, before we just kind of expect a state towards accountability without putting these pieces aligned to. And the research was clear here too. And like I said at the beginning of this, that this sort of accountability as threat, those employees aren't going to last long because they want to leave and they're not happy. And obviously we don't want that as well. But I'll pause there. Emma or Will, anything to add?
I do have one question that is coming in actually a couple times over in our Q&A, is the idea of the link between any kind of cultural difference and accountability, and whether or not you think maybe stereotype threat might come into play. Any thoughts here?
That's a great question. Specifically stereotype threat, to the degree to which that might play a role.
Or if you think about maybe the cultural differences that we're thinking about in terms of like our scarf domains, for instance,
Yeah,
like we
right.
brought scarf into this, and like the differences in sensitivities to maybe like status threat might differ across cultures. Sense of like autonomy might differ across cultures, and how capable individuals feel. Such a good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of, my perception of how others view me, which might be something like a stereotype threat, and then me sort of feeding into that myself, right? And having that sort of demoralizing link there too. Yeah, so I could definitely see that. And that, I think maybe the bigger picture there is that, there's so many factors in terms of what's the reality in terms of the system that exists within the organization, how and what's the relationship between that, it's the degree to which it's fine-tuned for growth accountability, but then also what's the perception of it, right? Because that's critical as well. So you need to be clear about both of those things. You can't just, implement what you believe is a good accountability system and imagine assume immediately that everyone's perception will align nicely to that too, right? And not only that, there's accountability at so many different levels. There's accountability at the organizational structural level, which we'll talk about, but then there's accountability in terms of the interpersonal relationships that exist across teams, right? Across manager-employee relationships, team dimensions between teams as well, right? So there's so many different factors there to consider that where your perception could change in really complicated and nuanced ways, I think, throughout the organization as well.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts coming up? Well, I think that, as we think about all of this research, so we've been doing a ton of research and now understanding where this comes up and where we want to get to. We have this from to shift. We want to get to more of a growth accountability, and understanding how to produce that both with our understanding of how the brain works and what we see in the workplace. These are the three general habits we're thinking about. And we often love to talk about the major habits we want to embed to create the culture. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, both in what are the neural underpinnings of each of these, and what does it look like on the workplace?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the neural underpinnings, Will, and I'll throw it out over to you. So yeah, for think ahead, I think the science underpinning here is the power of kind of imagining what it would take to accomplish a task that you've assigned yourself or that you've been assigned, right? And more than that, about what broadly is your role, what's your role in this project, how does it relate to the collaborative relationship you have with your teammates, etc. But the point in terms of the neuroscience is that we know really clearly that the degree to which we spend time and effort imagining how we will accomplish a task and starting to understand the different contingencies that might come into play there, the roadblocks we might face, and starting to build a plan for those things, the more able we're going to be to accomplish those goals. And so if we do that on a personal level, that's great. But then we also need to branch out and do that throughout like a more collective understanding of everyone's role, so we're seeing this clearer and clearer picture about what's the path that's lined out and what are the contingencies in case these roadblocks that we're starting to understand more and more come up, and we understand that not only about our own role in some project, but about our colleagues as well. So I think that's really the heart of the think ahead task, is really thinking those things clearly. And then I think what comes to that and how this follows into the commitments we make is that, we want to know what we're committing to, right? And thinking ahead will help us with that. But I'll pause there. Will, anything coming up for you before we move on?
Yeah, I think really when you're talking about that, think of it, it's about creating clarity for yourself and then thinking about how you do that for others. And then also, is it a lot of times we're willing to take on a task or say, I'll be accountable for that, or taking on the accountability without fully thinking through the time commitments. Time blindness comes up, right? Or, we're kind of all putting out fires in this VUCA world that we're in, and thinking about how that comes through to help then get the resources you might need to actually accomplish that too. I think is a differentiator between that is a growth-centered accountability versus sort of a punitive accountability. We're just taking that on without thinking through. And then I love the obsess about commitments. I don't know if obsess, I've seen some comments that may not be the right word, but I think the importance here is that you want to think of it as like your inner 3-year-old. When you promise that you're going to get your child ice cream, that they just consistently remember that you said you're going to get that ice cream. It's kind of that idea of, you said you were going to do this by Friday at 5, and you're not Friday at 3 being like, I wonder if Monday's okay. It's about sort of having that prediction of, okay, if we say we're going to start a meeting on time, we start meetings on time, right?
Yeah.
If we say we're going to deliver it by Friday at 5, we do that. We don't let our, I like to call him Tomorrow William, take over and say, it's tomorrow's job, right? It's about really being obsessed about when you're sort of saying you're going to get something done. And then I think as you're talking through, we're getting to kind of own the outcome, and it's really just owning what actually happens and then being empowered to find that solution.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just add, and because we're on the fence about the word obsessed too in this habit, I think, as well. But part of that, I think, follows logically that like we're really clear, and it follows nicely from think ahead, that we're really clear about what we're committing to, right? So that we can obsess about it, and that so we can meet or even exceed expectations, right? And then what we said earlier too about, accountability having this strong social component to it as well, is that, we want to understand that that there's this interpersonal exchange happening here in terms of our commitments, right? It's not just about your role in a task, it's about everyone's role coming together, and all of the commitments that were made that are aligned properly to what people are capable of doing, what they're excited about, right? What they're optimistic about as well. So I think that obsession is about not so much about, oh my God, I said I was going to do this thing, now I have to do it. It's more like we're obsessed about those details so that we are like really motivated about the commitments that we made. I think is a good way to think about it. And then maybe I can move into own the outcome too, which I think in my mind, in terms of the underlying science, really has a strong like growth mindset lens to it, which you already said, I think, which is really in this case, and I think the neuroscience research that backs this up here nicely is that those that have a growth mindset have a stronger connections between this area of the brain that's responsible for error monitoring, which we talked about earlier, and the reward pathway. And so what we've seen is that those that have a growth mindset and that work in a culture that facilitates a growth mindset is that they're far more attentive to mistakes that are made. And I think that really brings in the whole story here, is that own the outcome is not own the things you did really well and forget about everything else, right? It's about being really honest and open and attentive to everything that happened, right, in terms of the outcome, so that you can learn from mistakes. And that would be reflected in the way our brains have been wired in terms of having a growth mindset that will have this subtle reward towards the insight that's generated through either why something was successful or why a mistake was made, or somewhere in between, right? Some things went well, some things didn't. We learned from all of it, and we didn't shy away from honest conversation in any piece of that puzzle. And I think that's really the heart of Own the Outcome.
Yeah. What's coming up for you, Will? Anything?
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking through the chat here, and I think there's a lot of really interesting questions, specifically about you know, obviously this is great, but how do I get this to happen in my culture, in my organization? How do I deal with the power dynamics? And I think I want to just reflect that that's something we're going to talk about here in a minute with some great research that that Ryan found and kind of underpinning this approach in a workplace, because this is really what you in particular can do, or the culture within it can do. But that's just one piece of creating an environment in which accountability can happen and thrive in a really positive way. And so I think that's an important thing to understand. And obviously, there is so much control that a certain person has. If your boss says, I need it done by 5, and you're the one who's responsible, you know, that is a form of punitive accountability that's coming to you that you necessarily don't have power over, right? And I think it's just important to acknowledge that. But that's why leaders are such a strong social influence in organizations. So if the senior leadership in the organization down through trickling down is doing this and taking this upon themselves, it's going to then transfer and create that culture that really allows this to happen.
That's a great point. Yeah, there are so many great comments coming in. And I wish we had like another hour to go through them all. But one thing that I think a very strong weave going through all of the comments and what your conversation has been around is this idea of clarity through so many levels. But what are the 2 really critical ones that we want to be like clear about? And this kind of feeds like a click deeper into our think ahead habit. Do you want to cover that, Ryan? That idea.
Oh, do you want me to take this one? Yeah, sure.
Sure.
So we talked about thinking ahead and having that clarity. I think we, you know, 2 of the key kind of realms for us to consider are our role and the task at hand, right? And that we're really making sure that we're creating the sort of collective clarity around these things, right? And I think in terms of, you know, we've said many times now, the social aspect and the hierarchical aspect of accountability too, is that, you know, there's agreement on not just your role in this task, but of your coworkers too, right? So we really want to dig deeply into clarifying these things as a critical foundation that we can build accountability on top of, right? Because, you know, I think regardless of intentions, if there's noise in the system in terms of, you know, what the initial agreement was and whether or not it's reasonable and whether or not we're motivated towards it, you're going to start gravitating towards this punitive accountability, because if there wasn't clarity in the initial understanding, then it's just this sort of blame game that might come sort of naturally afterwards. So really this first step is this like detailed understanding of role and task clarity in particular. William, anything to add there?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the research on like the current state of accountability is it's not a neglectful or malicious intent where people are like, I'm just not going to work. But while there is some of that, that's not the majority of the accountability issues. A lot of it actually stems from just these 2 pieces. So it's really, I don't know what my role is on this project, because so much of the work that happens right now is so much project based. It's not really a direct manager. You're working with a project lead and you're working with a bunch of team members. And so we just don't really understand where's the boundary of my role to your role, and what are the tasks within that role that I am actually supposed to work on and clarify. And that's a lot of what some great research out there, including Monday.com, did a really interesting piece of research on accountability. And most of it is, we start on this project, someone's got a great idea, we get a team assembled, and then we have 5 or 6 meetings, and then sort of nothing happens, right? And why does nothing happen? It's because we haven't clarified the role or the task for everyone really to achieve what it is we're looking to do. We've been on those projects, we've been on those committees. It's a lot of great energy that drives things forward, but without the clarity, you can't have that accountability piece. And I think that's so critical, especially as we're thinking about, you know, this, you know, growth-centered accountability or growth accountability piece is, you know, understanding your role, understanding how you want to grow in that role, and what solutions you need to own based on the tasks that you have. And I think there are things in which, you know, is it fair? Is it reasonable to? Part of that think ahead piece, right? You know, like, is this something I actually could do? Do I have the time and space and capacity? Because we're all amazingly wonderful people that sometimes really want to say yes in positions where we can't, and then we end up not following through on what we actually said we were going to do as well.
That's such a great point. And it brings up like some of the ideas that we're going to kind of talk about next. And one thing that just kept speaking to me is this idea of whether or not there is psychological safety to say that you don't have the skills, or to try if there's lack of clarity on what individuals are supposed to do, who's going to be the one that asks, what do I need to do? Or can I try this? Or can I experiment with this? I mean, if there isn't any psychological safety, no one will even try to step in and finish it. And so I think that necessary balance between the two is critical. And so that's just one thing that's coming up for me. But I know these are things that in your research you found were the critical pieces to getting this right. And so can you speak to the idea, Ryan, on leader humility, like what that is?
Yeah, so I think ultimately, and it's such a critical driver of behaviors and culture in the workplace, is the role modeling of everyone, but maybe in particular leaders in some realms more than others. But in terms of that, like, that initial freedom to speak openly about what our role is, what I'm comfortable doing, what I'm not, what mistakes were made, that starts from leader humility. I think that we have that freedom to talk to speak about those things and to really kind of own that outcome in a clear and honest way. And that's sort of one of the initial drivers, and you'll hear more about this next week when Amy Edmondson joins to talk about psychological safety. But that really is that driver for psychological safety, which is, I think, a critical foundation for accountability. And then what the research shows here that this is referencing is that once you have those things, formalization, which is really that more than just that role and task clarity, but like clarity built within the processes and alignment of the processes within an organization in a way that are coherent with the sort of accountability that hopefully growth accountability that you want. That's really like the amplifier to get accountability right in some ways. Once you have humility, leadership humility, and from everyone else as well, psychological safety. I'd add growth mindset as well. We've talked about that quite a bit. A lot of overlap there between growth mindset and psychological safety too. But that sort of process and system formalization is critical as well, as that real amplifying piece that then can get us to the growth accountability that we want.
What's
William,
coming to you, Will? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. And I think there's some really interesting comments in the chat about resourcing and having the tools to accomplish what you've been said to. And I think that's where that leader humility and the psych safety to have those conversations about clarity, because I think as one person wrote in here, there's, how do we have the conversation about clarifying roles and outcomes if we don't have the psych safety to do it to start with, right? And that is a really important thing. If you get on a team and everyone's sort of sitting there, we don't understand who's going to do what. I think there's a great piece within that we'll be talked a lot more next week about psych safety. But I think in terms of formalization, right, that's sort of the end cap or the bookend to how you sustain this over time, right? You can't have this great culture, leaders are humble, they're trying really hard, and then all your systems point to, please let us punish people for not getting things done and owning mistakes. Only promote leaders that take accountability for when they achieve success, right? And I think those are things that are important to have as you think about creating that full coherence of accountability within your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're kind of like leading us to like, where do we even begin then, right? Like what do we do? What are the steps to get started if you're thinking about helping leaders role model this? Well,
yeah, and I think thanks so much. And I think it really focused on really 3 key areas to begin with. And I think the first one here is upskilling leaders, right? So giving leaders the ability and the habits to understand, how do you have a performance conversation and provide feedback in a way for them to have a positive outcome, right? So having those skill sets, right, in being able to actually hold someone accountable in a growth-oriented way. Because I think so much of it is for managers and for leaders, we're not really understanding how we do that, right? So how do we create clarity? How do we create clarity within our systems too? And that really gets to the second point of articulating the essential. And a lot of the great leadership frameworks that we've built and culture frameworks really focus on that clarity piece to drive key results. And there's a really good, not only just from you see this presentation, but desire to have that happen, because it is so important to have, okay, what are the things that are most important for me to focus on to be successful in my organization, and allows us to have the capacity to then create clarity, to then have an ability to really focus on what is the essential things to get right in the organization. And then the biggest thing here that sort of summates both of those is really creating coherence. So having performance systems, having a feedback mechanism for your teams, for your managers, for employees, to have feedback that's frequent, to have debriefs after each project, having postmortems to understand what went wrong on this, or what went right, and how do we clarify at the beginning? Building in those systems, and probably most important within that summates that is your performance management system. How are you tracking conversations? How are you making sure that you have a culture where feedback is asked, not just from a manager to employee, but across the organization? And I think all of those things, when you have a coherent organization, really elevate the employee experience. And I think those are just the three keys of like where you'd want to start to create that organization that truly is accountable.
What's coming up for you, Ryan?
Yeah, well said. I think one thing that's coming up, and it's talked about quite a bit in the chat too, is that maybe one of those kind of initial foundation in terms of upskilling leaders is utilizing the SCARF model too, right? We're talking about a lot of potential threat here and what we mentioned before in terms of how accountability might be perceived, and what happens when you don't have the proper certainty in terms of what your role is on a task or on a project, right? So I think that like initially elucidating those domains for social threat and reward is such a critical foundation there too for leaders and everyone to understand as well when we're talking about just how accountability can go wrong, and that we can mitigate these things through this really clear understanding of of how we could be perceiving these things in a threatening way potentially, and how they could actually be threatening based on what's actually established within the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one thing that like just when talking about like the next steps forward and the fact that we're constantly updating our understanding of the world based on that, like that core motivational goal pursuit system that you brought up in the very beginning, is that it's constantly updating. So these are things that we can very easily change as long as the habits that people are showing are consistent. So making sure that you have the systems in place that are enforcing and rewarding behaviors, promoting the people that are demonstrating accountability, and like making sure that everyone is holding each other accountable, having that psychological safety, like enforcing those behaviors. So that I think like all of the comments that are coming in and all the questions that are coming in, like kind of enforce the idea that everyone is thinking about it, trying to get this right. But the good thing is the light kind of here in this problem that we're trying to solve is that our brains are incredibly plastic. We're able to easily like make new understandings of the world around us and like update our sense of like what we can trust, the certainty around us, and like creating those expectations and setting them that it's easy to change as long as we have the right set of behaviors to do so. So I think this was an amazing conversation. There are way too many questions to answer given the time we have. I mean, I'd love to hear, before we kind of move on to the last kind of bit here, any final thoughts that are coming up for you all, given like the conversations and the chats and the questions. Will?
I think there was a lot of really good questions about coherence. And I think for me, that's something that I think is just critically important anytime you're trying to build a new culture or change. And I think it's really about, how does what you say, what does leadership say, what is experienced and what is done align together. And I think anytime you're trying to, whether this is DEI or whether this is accountability, it's just so critical to have those pieces together. And that's a really great point that I think a lot of people are making here at the end is, how do we get all these different issues together? And it's about really creating that coherence is the final piece.
Yeah. What about for you, Ryan?
Yeah, agreed. And I think, I'm reminded of a question earlier in the chat about, about how generalizable is a growth mindset. Do I have to have a growth mindset in every situation? What if someone doesn't have a growth mindset when I do? And all of those are entirely valid concerns. And what we've shown, and what Emma, what you were talking before too, about the brain being really incredibly plastic, and Will, what you're talking about having that alignment across systems, is that, we will adjust in general contingent on the reward pathway that exists in our environment, right? So if we get those systems aligned to push us towards to wanting to progress in a certain realm, and we're rewarded for that, and we're and that we're encouraged to do that by our leaders as well, you'll see growth mindsets sprouting up in areas where maybe it didn't exist before too. So that's not to say you have to progress in every possible skill all the time across the board, but we tend to align to what exists in our environment. And so if we get that environment right and it's coherent, then we'll see that growth mindset emerging too in ways that it doesn't exist in this moment, let's say.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. This was such a great discussion. I know that I don't really want it to end, and there are tons of comments in here that I think what this is really encouraged us to think about is how better we can like solidify our understanding of accountability and all of the different ways that are coming up for all the different factors that people were mentioning in the chat. So the chat that you're the conversations that you're adding to the chat are fantastic. The questions, we'll continue to think about this and write about it and come back on for more discussion. So look forward to that. One thing that I did want to call out towards the end is just that we are we're hoping that you'll think about taking our SCARF assessment again. I know that anyone who's been with us the last few weeks, we've been talking about this, take it again, because one thing that we do know is that our sensitivities within these different domains of how we perceive threat and reward in our personal environments and our interactions may change depending on the day, depending on your mindset, whether you're tired or energized or what you're coming out of in terms of whether you had a stressful meeting or not. So definitely take it again, and we're going to be answering some research questions in this realm as well. And one more thing I will highlight is that everything that we've talked about today and everything that we talked about last week will be kind of like brought together and combined in a session next week with Amy Edmondson and our Dr. David Rock, talking about like how this balance comes together. So creating an environment of psychological safety, the need for accountability as well, and how you can have both, and they're actually both necessary. Anyways, I will pass it back over to Shelby, and thank you, Ryan and Will. This was a fantastic discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emma, Will, and Ryan. Again, we appreciate you and all that you shared today. For our closing, we are just going to do some announcements, and we also have our poll up, so let us know how NLI can help you in the future. If you missed our summit this year, we do still have our on-demand pass, so if you're interested in seeing a replay of the panels and different things that we discussed, check that out. We also really love having you here with us, so we do have a season pass where you can sign up in advance for all of the Y-Balls. So our team will drop that link as well, and we'll share it in the follow-up email later. Also, if you enjoyed the conversation here, then you'll love the podcast. We have a lot of similar topics and things there. So wherever you listen, check out Your Brain at Work. And this is where we officially say farewell. So on behalf of our team and everyone behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here again. And we will see you next week for another great episode.